So how can we send a post request when we click Add Movie to submit that movie data we collected to Firebase? Well, we already got this Add Movie handler, which is in the end triggered when Add Movie is clicked. And there we get a movie object, which in the end contains a title, an opening text, and a release date. An ID will be added by Firebase automatically. So in the end here, it's in this Add Movie handler where we want to send another HTTP request by using the fetch API. And I mentioned, even though it's called fetch, it's not just there to fetch data, you can also use that same function to send data. Might sound strange, but that's just how it works. Of course, by the way, you could also outsource some code into separate functions, maybe also stored in other files, to keep this file lean. Here, for education purposes, I'll keep it all in one file. So back to Add Movie Handler. We want to send a request. And of course, I want to send it to the same URL which I use for getting my data. Otherwise, getting would never succeed. But I said that fetch by default sends a GET request. And here we now need a POST request. The fetch API works such that you can pass a second argument to fetch. And you can use that argument to configure this outgoing request. And for example, you can set the method key. By default, this is GET. But here we can set it to POST to send a POST request. And if you send a POST request to this endpoint at our Firebase service, Firebase will go ahead and create a resource in the database. Now, what happens exactly when sending a POST request to some URL always depends on the backend you're using. It's not set in stone that sending a POST request will always create a resource, even though it typically will. But it always depends on the concrete API. Here, for Firebase, sending a POST request will create a resource. So we also need to add that resource, which should be stored. And we do that with the body option here on this fetch API configuration object. Here I want to pass on my movie, though body doesn't want a JavaScript object like this. Instead, it wants JSON data. I mentioned before that JSON is this data format which is typically used for exchanging data between frontend and backend. Now, to convert a JavaScript object to JSON, we can use a utility method which exists in JavaScript. We can use the JSON object, which is built into browser-side JavaScript, and call stringify. And this basically takes a JavaScript object or array and turns it into JSON format. Now, last but not least, we need to add some headers, or to be precise, one header, which we do by adding the headers key and setting an object as a value. And that's the content type header written like this, which should be set to application JSON. Technically, this header is not required by Firebase. It would be able to handle the request even if that header is not set. But a lot of REST APIs to which you might be sending requests later might require this extra header, which describes the content that will be sent, and therefore setting it is not a bad idea. And I will set it here even though it's technically not required. And with that, we'll send a POST request with that data to this URL. Again, this will be an asynchronous task and we get back a promise, so we can again use async await here to await our response. And then we can also get our response data by awaiting response.json, because Firebase also sends back data in JSON format. And for the moment, we can console log that data. Now, of course, we could also add error handling here, and also wrap this with try catch, and do the same as we did before. Set error if we get an error, and so on. I'll not do that here though, because I want to keep this short and focused, but we could do exactly the same as we did before for getting data. Now with that though, we hopefully do store some data. So if I now reload, I can try entering a title here, my first movie, and some text here, and some release date of our choice, doesn't matter at all, and click Add Movie. And now let's have a look at the Firebase backend. And here in the real-time database, you should see a new Movies node. because we sent this request to /movies here. And in that movies node, you find this cryptic ID, which was auto-generated by Firebase. And there you find the data which was sent. So this worked. In the React app, if you open the developer tools, in the JavaScript console, you should also see the response object you got back from Firebase. And there Firebase replied with that auto-generated ID, which was stored in some name field. So this is how we can send a post request. Now, if we click fetch movies, it should be able to get back some movies, but of course our logic for transforming these movies doesn't work anymore. Previously we expected that we have a results field in our result, but now actually that's not the case anymore. If I console log the data we get back here when fetching movies, if I console log that, you will see that if I reload, the data we get back is an object where we have the cryptic ID as a key, and then another nested object with the actual movie data. So we're not getting back an array, but an object, where the IDs are keys and then the data are nested objects. So we just need to transform this appropriately to again display our movies. So therefore here, we're not using map anymore. Instead now here, we could simply create an array, loaded movies, which initially is empty, and then create a for in loop to loop through all the keys in data, because data is now an object, as I just mentioned, and keys are the IDs of the movies, actually, as you saw here. And then we simply want to go to loaded movies and push a new object for every key value pair we got in the response data, and set ID equal to key, set title equal to data for the given key dot title. So here we're drilling into that nested object we got in the response. We're drilling into this object here, where we have a title, opening text, and release date. This is how we dynamically access a property in JavaScript. And we're doing that for the title, for the opening text, and then also, last but not least, for the release date. Here we also do that like this. And there would be other ways of writing that transformation logic, but this way is hopefully very easy to understand. So then we got our loaded movies, which now again is an array full of objects which have the structure we expect. And therefore we can now get rid of this code and set our movies here equal to loaded movies, which is this array we just built. And with that, if I reload, you see that data is now loaded. And if I now add a second movie with more text and a release date of 2022, sometime in August, I can click add movie. And if I fetch my movies thereafter, I get this second movie as well. And of course, you could now tweak this app. You could make sure that new movies are fetched automatically after a movie was submitted. You can add error handling in the add movie handler. You can do all of that, but this is just a demo to show you the core parts that are involved when it comes to sending HTTP requests. And you now saw how you can set a GET request here to get data, and how you can send a POST request to store data. Both matters in many applications, and now you know both. And you also know how you can handle different states and errors. We didn't do it here for add movie handler, but it would work in exactly the same way as for getting our movies with fetch movies handler.